Hey folks, BlackCross here. Welcome to another episode of Deep Dive into Gaming, where I look at the games that I have previously played / have played in the past, and basically give my total in-thought as to how I felt about the game and everything like that. And with most of my episodes, I usually talk about 1, maybe even 3, but in this case, we're going to be talking about 6 total games. That's right, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy 1 through 6, as I just recently played through all of them on my live stream Twitch. So if you haven't checked that out, by all means, please do check out Twitch. But of course, they are here on YouTube, so if you want to check those out, you are more than welcome to check out the playlist of all 6 Final Fantasy games that I have played on live stream. But what got me started into wanting to play all of the Final Fantasy games that I have not played, being that of 1 through 6 with the exception of 4, but I'll get to that in a sec, is simply because it started out with this right here, Final Fantasy Ancelage, which contains Final Fantasy 5 and 6. Now, I did not know that technically some of the Final Fantasy games got re-released on the PlayStation 1. I did not know this. So I was like, might want to look into it. And by the time I did, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm going to get all the Final Fantasy games. Now, there were, of course, some exceptional rules to this whole spiel of claiming that I played every Final Fantasy game, and that being the case of 11 and 14. 11 and 14 are both MMORPGs, so naturally the entire fan base believes that they are more or less excluded because they are MMORPGs in and of themselves, which means they are never ending. So, by claiming you have completed Final Fantasy 11 and or 14, is a bit of a stretch, per se, because they're always adding in new content every single time they get a chance to, especially in 14's case. 14 has so far had like a total of like 5 different installments from what I've counted. I may have lost track. For those of you who have played Final Fantasy 14, please by all means put in the comment as to how many installments they have had so far, because I've lost count. But that's beside the point. The point is that I want to talk about the first 6. Now, I'm going to be talking about my first experience with them, and while in some cases, technically in 4th case, I played the DS version, but I want to talk about them in order in terms of their release per se. First and foremost, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy Origins, which contains Final Fantasy 1 and 2. So I figure we go ahead and kind of talk about Final Fantasy 1 in general. Now, I know technically Final Fantasy 1 got released on the NES way back in the early days, 30 years ago, or in this case almost 31 years at this rate. But with that being said, I decided to play the PlayStation 1 version. So overall, from what I played on Final Fantasy 1, how did I enjoy it? Well, for starters, I realized how majorly different it was compared to the main series later on that I would soon get started with. It was drastically different. For example, there were no summons whatsoever. And in terms of the magic terms, they were instead called like Fire 1, Fire 2, and Fire 3. And it was kind of like a weird spill up, because instead of like learning your spells and stuff like that, you were instead buying your spells. And I was like, this is extremely unusual and kind of weird, but at the same time, it's a little bit different. But then again, keep this in mind, this was made in the ideal consumption towards the Dungeons & Dragons franchise, which was basically a book series, or book/board/ however way you want to play it type thing. I've heard there was multiple ways of how you can play Dungeons & Dragons, but it's funny of how Dungeons & Dragons ended up creating what would soon become Final Fantasy. Now, I know technically that's not the only story that is behind it, but that's basically the main concept of what caused the creation for Final Fantasy to begin with. And when you look in that ideal aspect, it makes it a little bit more, I guess the term would be doable, in terms of like you being able to play it. If you were to look at it as a Final Fantasy, you'd be like, this is completely dated. But if you were to look at it and say this was to be a physical representation of what Dungeons and Dragons are, you would have thought to yourself, this is actually pretty good. And in all honesty, Final Fantasy 1 is actually pretty good on its own. There are some major differences between the NES and the NES and the PS1 version, obviously being that there were a couple of classes added on to the PlayStation 1 versus what was originally released on the NES. And compared to the two, which one do you think I would prefer? I think if I was to look at them and play them both, I think I would still enjoy the PlayStation 1 just a little bit better, mostly because in terms of the bit rate. Let's keep this in mind, the NES was not exactly as sharp a tune, but then again, in terms of how I am in terms of retro, I actually go for like the N64, which is as far as back as I can. But if I had to say, I don't mind the 16-bit rate. I mean, it's actually pretty nice to see it in that style. Plus, in terms of artistically looks, it looks a lot better actually. I mean, you do the comparison and, well, it's a little bit nicer. Then again, it was also released for the PSP, which is actually a lot more sharper, especially if you do an emulator of the PSP. For some reason, the PlayStation Portable emulator for Final Fantasy 1 is a lot sharper, as my friend has showed me in the past. And would I prefer that versus the PlayStation 1? I don't know. I mean, considering Final Fantasy 1 was like 30 years old right now, it would be better just to keep it as a retro bit rather than sharper image, pure 2D scale type look. Because, I don't know, it's just, I'm not saying that I don't like it, I'm just saying I'm going to be in the middle ground compared to the NES and the PSP. But in terms of like music, gameplay, and everything like that, I actually kind of liked it. It wasn't that bad. It was majorly different than what I thought it would be, but at the same time, it was what I expected it to be. It was basically a free roaming experience, as well as something majorly different than what we actually got in present day. Now let's talk about Final Fantasy II. And Final Fantasy II, I'm not going to lie whenever I say this. Final Fantasy II is a love and hate relationship. And I say this because of its core gameplay mechanic. That core gameplay mechanic is leveling up your individual stats. Number one, I actually kind of like it, because it gives you a growth experience in terms of your heroes, your characters even. But in terms of like the long run, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Number one being the case that if you didn't have the manual and you didn't have anything like that, you would have been completely screwed back in the NES days. And unless you had a friend who knew about the game and has played it religiously, you wouldn't know what to level up technically. Nowadays we have the internet and we can easily figure out exactly, okay, we need to level up our strength by basically attacking a lot of monsters. To level up HP, we have to lose a lot of HP during battle. To increase our acceleration, our invasion, we have to have a shield, and it gets added up all total. But on the one hand, I actually don't mind it. It's a creative way to level up your characters. But on the flip side, it is a very grindy experience. I think in terms of like a grind fest, it's actually a lot longer compared to just leveling up your stats, because you're not gaining experience points, you're gaining experience in terms of like how often things occur. Like for example, whenever I finally figured out that by increasing your accuracy, you have to have your shield, and I'm like, that seems kind of weird. Wouldn't it be the other way around and having a bow? But apparently it works, and that's how I was able to hit a lot of enemies, because at the later points I was starting to realize that I wasn't hitting anything, and I was like, okay, I need to figure out how to hit enemies, because if I keep missing, I'm going to die quicker. So whenever I looked it up and I was like, a shield? Okay. And then of course to increase your speed and evasion, you have to have less armor on. And it's like, so in other words, I've been playing this all wrong. So again, Final Fantasy II is a love and hate relationship. I do love the story, however, it is an interesting story. But at the same time, the level up system is a little bit off. It's just one of those things where it's like, you're glad you played it once, but you doubt you're going to play it again for a second time anytime soon. In other words, I think I would go back and play 1, preferably, than I would with 2, and that says quite a bit. Also, real quickly, I want to go ahead and say this. In terms of both cases, for Final Fantasy 1 and 2, I kind of wish there was like a halfway save point for it, because, let's put it this way. In Final Fantasy 1, you start going into the dungeon for the final boss. You have to fight 4 bosses before you get to the final one. Now, record, these 4 bosses are more or less sub-bosses at this point in the game, but unless you're like way above level 50, it can be a little bit challenging. Even I found this out the hard way, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have to level up. Final Fantasy 2, on the other hand, at least I had my character's HP up, I had all of their stats leveled up pretty well and stuff, so it made it a little bit easier, but that still doesn't help the fact that a halfway checkpoint would have been nice to have. Then again, they're trying to stick to the original, and the original didn't really have much in terms of save points. And in terms of save points, the only time you could do that was out in the field, so it was one of those hit and misses, I guess you could say. Now let's talk about Final Fantasy III. Now, technically, the original Final Fantasy III never got released in America. It only came out in Japan. Therefore, the only thing we got close to Final Fantasy III was the DS. And keep in mind, I don't have a DS capture card, so what was I left to do with? Go on Steam, because I found a program to where I could actually record gameplay footage in PC. So it worked out really well. I was actually glad that I finally was able to get PC recording experience in that perspective. But it was basically the same basic premise of the DS version. So, what did I think about Final Fantasy III? Well, it's, I'm not going to say it's bad. Okay, let me just say it that way. I'm not going to say it's bad, but in terms of, like, how the characters are, there wasn't really a lot of character interaction, per se. Again, not to say it was bad, but in terms of, like, how the characters interact with each other, it felt kind of limited. You know, Final Fantasy II had a little bit better character development compared to Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy I had no character development, but that's only because of the fact that it was custom character creation at its earliest age. Final Fantasy II had pre-created characters, and they had a fleshed out story. Final Fantasy III, character-wise, wasn't really that well done. But the job system, admittedly, I kind of liked it, but at the same time, it felt like it was holding itself back. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but in terms of like how the jobs should be dealt with, it was probably the fact that because of it being Final Fantasy III, it was like that to begin with. Like, you were still having to purchase your spells and everything like that. So, your characters, while they were leveling up their jobs, they weren't really learning spells. They were just having to be purchased in the same process. As for the summons, they were pretty good on their own. I actually kind of liked them in that extent. And the entire game itself was pretty okay on that end. I think if I had to say anything about Final Fantasy III, is that it was okay, but it was kind of forgettable to some degree. Again, not to say it was a bad experience, but compared to like that of Final Fantasy 1 and 2, where it was a major difference, Final Fantasy 3 stayed in that middle ground where it didn't really do anything major in terms of progression. Again, if you get my premise on that part. Now we're going to talk about Final Fantasy 4, which was on Final Fantasy Chronicles, which is funny because technically the only Chronicle thing is Final Fantasy 4, but the second one was Chrono Trigger, which I have not played yet. I will eventually, so don't worry about that. But I want to go ahead and talk about Final Fantasy 4 because my first time experience was actually that of the DS version. Now, in terms of like which one I liked it better, I think I would actually like the DS version better, mostly because of graphical improvement, as well as voice acting. It's just me, you know, it's just, I actually like having voice actors rather than having to read the lines myself, even though apparently some people like my voice acting works, even though it's not really voice acting, it's just trying to do voice acting for these different characters. But that aside, though, the DS version I actually like a little bit better just because of those little advancements. But in terms of the overall scale of things, it's pretty much the same from like the original versus the DS version, which I think when you look at the PlayStation 1, it was literally a port from the, I believe it was NES. It may have been the SNES, I don't remember right off. But it was ported from that and put on the PlayStation 1, which doesn't look that bad, but you could tell there was quite a decrease in terms of like what they did. You know, if you were to play through like I did with Origins and then go to Chronicles, there was a decrease in terms of like what they did. Obviously it wasn't like a, hey, let's try to do a little bit better improvement for Final Fantasy IV. It was, no, let's just port the game onto the disc. That was it. But the story was actually really good. I think in terms of story, I liked it a little bit better than 3. It's not better than 2, however. 4 kind of stayed in that same realm as 3 did. Story-wise, it was kind of like, it was better than 3, but it wasn't better than 2. In terms of like how the entire game level up system and everything like that worked, I actually liked it pretty okay. That was where Final Fantasy began to have a staple of like, okay, you're going to level up your characters and learn different abilities in the process, but you're also going to learn different job applications. For example, the Paladin, the Dark Knight. Obviously you have Twin Sorcerers and everything like that. And again, it was more of a different experience per se. And the fact that you had multiple characters, while you couldn't interchange with them all at one time, you got to experience a lot of different job applications that would soon be implicated throughout most of the Final Fantasy franchise. And I think this was where most people got more familiar with the job application. Final Fantasy III, again, was a little bit more forgettable, but Final Fantasy IV, I say because of all the standard characters, you got to learn a little bit better about all the different spells, all the different jobs, and all the different stuff that you could technically do. So, let's go ahead and move on to Final Fantasy V, which was part of the Final Fantasy Entourage. Now, Final Fantasy V, I had my doubts on it, okay? Let me just put it in that perspective. No one talked about 5. I knew nothing about 5. Much like about Final Fantasy 2, I didn't really know that much. But with Final Fantasy V, at the time, no one talked about 5. I was thinking to myself, I was like, is this like the black sheep of the family or something like that? And as I got started, I was like, this is actually getting pretty good. And I got further and further, and I was like, why hasn't no one talked about it? And that's only because I hadn't really zoned myself into that category of the fan base. And because of that, I got more familiar with Final Fantasy V overall. And I knew that technically 5 was the start of Gilgamesh, but I had no idea about its original origin. And it isn't until you look at how the creator came up with Gilgamesh, it's actually based on an actual story. A folktale story that was told in Japan, but a story nonetheless that related to the Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy V. And I have to say, I actually like the job system in Final Fantasy V a little bit better than 3. There's a big difference because, number one, you're not having to purchase your spells. You are actually learning your spells. And second of all, in terms of like how the spells work, you have different abilities and different spells. But the only way you can learn these things is if you level up your job application and you learn these different abilities. Now, the cool thing about these different abilities is that they can be attached by a second ability slot. So in other words, let's say you were studying under the, what's a good one to use? Used under the application of the samurai job. As you level up the samurai job, you learn different abilities and components. Some of these components could be either a separate ability, like Toss, where you basically throw Guild to do damage. Sometimes it could be actually something completely different. For example, two-sword technique, where you wield two swords at the same time to where you're able to actually do double damage. Sometimes it can be being able to use a samurai sword with a different job application, because let's say you are a dragoon, meaning that you only use a halberd. Well, if you have the sword katana attachment, you can equip it, and now you can actually equip a katana rather than just a halberd. Again, it allowed it to be a little bit more creative in terms of how you level up your characters. And And if I had to say, I actually really do like the animation that they go for in Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V is where they actually made the push in terms of development, and in terms of how the characters react, I really enjoyed it. The way they make the facial motion, and despite the fact that it's a 16-bit character, it made it way more emotional than it normally could have been. You know, you have your standard fall character animation, you have your standard, like, character walk cycle, but to have a character look like they're laughing or feeling any kind of emotion whatsoever, that's a lot of work to put into, but to see that being put into Final Fantasy V, that was really good. It just, to me, I think Final Fantasy V stood out the most since then. And I really enjoyed it 5. However, that leads on to the next one. Final Fantasy VI. Where do I begin with this? Everyone was right about Final Fantasy VI. I cannot believe I'm saying this, but holy shit, everyone was right. Final Fantasy VI is that good of a game. If you had any doubts about Final Fantasy VI, take it from me, who never played Final Fantasy VI, who's always been a fan of Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VI does a tremendous job. It has everything you can imagine that you would expect from some of your favorite Final Fantasy games. Basically, collecting items, collecting summons, learning these different abilities through these collectible summons and stuff like that. It was very much enjoyable, and I love the story. It combined the elements of the emotional feel from Final Fantasy V and enhanced it just a little bit better, and at the same time improved the story. Not only that, but you also have the fact that Kefka, being the main villain of the game, from what people told me about Kefka, they were about half right in terms of story. Then again, I'm glad they never really explained the full story of Kefka, but they were more or less explaining the second half of the story. To know the first half of the story and learn who he is and everything like that, kind of gave it a little bit more meaning as to who he really is and where he came from. As to such as how it has evolved, it was more or less of like, wow, they have a clown destroying the world. But for reasons, of course. Much less like the Joker, why he went insane, and basically of how he just wants to see the world burn is because, well, he still thinks the world is chaotic and malevolent as he is. Which, there's some truth to that, but that's aside the point. The point is, Kefka was like, I have to say, I thought my favorite villain was like either Sephiroth or something like that. No, Kefka still is a show. It's just, wow. I was impressed by that. But also, too, the different summons that was in Final Fantasy VI, aka the Espers, rather. I have to say, it took a long time to finally get to the point where I was collecting the Espers and I was using their powers. But when I finally did, I began to realize that this was actually pretty interesting. It was basically the same concept as Final Fantasy VII, where I collected the materia because I needed their power. Whereas the Espers, I needed their power, but they had more abilities. They had more different spells uses. And because of that, it made it more necessary to learn every spell within each individual Esper. And then, of course, you have the different relics that can be used to help your entire adventure. You know, you have some basic relics, like, that prevents petrification, prevents zombie, and stuff like that. But then you have some of the more advanced ones, like, consumes half MP, doubles your MP, doubles your HP. There's technically an item, but I never could get it because that freaking dinosaur won't die. But there's an item where you can actually equip it and it will only consume 1 MP for every spell, which is crazy. But also, too, to have double cast, which is sort of like ×2 in Final Fantasy VII, which I absolutely love that type of ability, and to know that Final Fantasy VI has this ability, I knew for a fact that I was going to get it regardless of what it is, but I did not know about the double attack move. Or should I say, the quadruple attack maneuver. Because when you have the relic, where you use 2 weapons at the same time, which allows you to do a double attack move, plus that, I think the most attacks I'd done with one character was probably 6 to 8 times. It's insane. I thought to myself, did I just break the game? I think I broke the game. I literally broke the game because of that ability. But to that extent, I think the biggest question I think people are going to have is that, how do I feel about Final Fantasy VI versus Final Fantasy VII? Because in terms of like what is considered to be the best Final Fantasy game, it's usually a tug of war. So how do I feel about Final Fantasy VI versus Final Fantasy VII? It's kind of early to say because it's like, oh my god, Final Fantasy VI is so good, but I love Final Fantasy VII. But Final Fantasy VI has so much cool stuff that could be done, but so does 7. But then Final Fantasy VI has some summons that allows you to learn different abilities. But then you have Final Fantasy VII with all the different materials to customize, and it's just, both systems are really, really good. And both of them are really, really well balanced. So it's like, which one is better? It is too soon for me to say which one is better, because quite frankly, both of them are pretty much equaled up to par as to quality of a Final Fantasy game, in my personal opinion. I know some people would say Final Fantasy X is better, some might even say Final Fantasy VII or 6, some might even say that 5, or even for that of 12, maybe even 15, who knows really. But so far, in terms of like the first 6 that I have finally played, oh my gosh, I have to say, I really do love them, but in terms of like what I've played so far up to this point, 5 and 6 has definitely won my favorites. I never thought that I would say that it was easier for me to do a top 10, but never have I thought that it would be just as hard to determine my top 10 favorites because of how well 5 and 6 does in terms of the Final Fantasy franchise and how well they are. It's just, they're both really enjoyable, and I really enjoy them as a whole. So, anyway though, let me know in the comments below, of the first 6 Final Fantasy games, how do you feel about them? Have you played any of them at all? And if not, give them a shot. I highly recommend you at least try playing them at least once, you know, and then determine which one is your absolute favorite of the first 6. Later on, probably within the next year at this point, I will be talking about the later half, which is basically the majority of the games that I have played prior to before all of this. So, anyway though, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy this, and I will see you in the next video. This is BlackCross signing off. See you later, guys.